May the merits of these teachings benefit all beings. May these words help and not harm. May they clarify and not confuse. May they self-liberate, leaving no trace behind. All right, good evening, everybody. Colette, first of all, welcome. It's really good to have you, really good to practice with you. First time with us, welcome. And of course, welcome, especially to Yeshe and Zopa. It is so good to practice with you and to have you here. I have been sharing with a group over the last few months about some of our conversations and my excitement at being in the midst of fellow teachers, Dharma practitioners, and being able to speak about the Dharma and learn about our different traditions and just the different ways in which we take in and then express the teachings. And so I had for some time been wanting to share that in different ways with the group. And so I thought I would start doing this, right? Inviting fellow teachers to join us, share a practice with us, and then have a conversation. And so I want to come back to that practice because there's so many things in it. So I'd love to come back to it. But if we could start, if you could share a little bit with us your path. How did you become Yeshe and Zopa? How did you meet? And what is it like, to be able to, in the context of your marriage, be able to share and teach the Dharma? So if you can tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure, I guess I'll start. I was very interested in lots of brainy kinds of things when I was growing up. I was a biology student and really loved science, and was in graduate school heading towards a doctorate in biology, but decided that didn't quite work for me, and decided to go to law school, and I did that. And I did a lot of intellectual property and insurance and health law because it combined those two fields. And, I would say that I came to Dharma because all of these things that I was told when I was growing up, I'm a first generation Latinx American person. And my family emigrated from Cuba. My parents emigrated from Cuba when Castro took power, very soon after he took power, before the very large wave of exiles. But there was a real focus on success and striving and hitting that American dream. That was a very big part of the immigrant experience for me growing up. And I felt like I'd done all those things. I checked all those boxes, and there wasn't much happiness in sight that I was told to expect from that. There was some contentment, of course, and there were some good things about it, but it seemed that all of the contentment and success brought with it new kinds of ways to be uncomfortable and discontent in addition to the ones that were there. So I started to explore meditation and eventually Dharma. The Tibetan Buddha Dharma was particularly compelling to me because I felt that it both hit the strengths of the intellectual curiosity that was always a part of my life, and also provided a much more experiential basis for meditation. So it was a very good marriage of theory and practice that I hadn't found before. It was very one-sided for me in life. And having that combination was really compelling for me. It was something I really enjoyed doing and wanted to do more of. So I decided I had the opportunity actually to leave work on good conditions and go and spend a year or two in Asia and study at this fancy monastery in Nepal where I could get really in depth in the teachings. And so I did that. It's Pulahari Monastery near Kathmandu. And I met Zopa there. He had already been going for about a year. And we ended up studying and practicing there for several years. We were living in Asia between Nepal and India. Our root guru is Bokar Rinpoche, who's monastery is in northeast India. So we spent a lot of time there studying and practicing, learning Tibetan language, being trained as translators, and then eventually started to divide our time between the US and Asia, and prepare for the traditional 3-year retreat, which in our lineage is the training. It's one of the ways, not the only way, but it's one of the ways that people become authorized teachers. And it's one of the few ways to become a Lama, which is a title which generally means teacher, but literally means highest mother. It's meant to be a very nourishing kind of role that we play with our students. So that's the general outline for me. Do you want to say
Can
a
I
little?
just ask a quick question? When you say fancy monastery, what do you mean? Because that's not my experience of monastery life.
Yeah, that's a perfect question, because when I started out, I was raised, my family was, my mother is Protestant and my father was Catholic, but my mother wasn't very observant and my father was. So I felt like I was raised very Catholic. I went to Catholic school, I went to the churches. And when I was looking for a Dharma center, I was avoiding those Tibetan centers because they looked too Catholic to me. All the incense and the chanting and the colors, and I was all for that nice Zen aesthetic, which is not fancy. But the Tibetan Dharma centers are extremely colorful. It's an explosion of almost chaotic sensory experience. And the monastery, Pulahari, that I eventually went to, is very much in that line. It's very elaborate. There's gilded statues and very elaborate tapestries or tankas and different techniques, either painted or embroidery. It's fancy in a way that's almost opposite to the, I think, absolutely elegant, beautiful simplicity of a Zen monastery. So it's a very different experience, and it's one of the ways that I think our traditions on the outside seem very different. But in my experience, I think the Zen tradition is probably closer to others, than others, to the Tibetan outlook on Dharma, despite the radically different aesthetic.
But fancy doesn't mean like a lot of creature comforts. Like certainly when we were there, a lot of the time it was in the winter when there's no heating and the buildings are on the north side of the hill. You know, bathrooms outside, things like that. So not fancy in the 5-star hotel kind of fancy.
Right. And so how about you, Zopa?
I grew up in northern New Mexico in a spiritual community that was founded by a Western guy that kind of combined Christian mysticism and Buddhism and some other things. And that teacher died when I was quite young. I don't have any memories of him, but the community stayed together. And then eventually around the time that I was 12 or so, some of the people got involved in Tibetan Buddhism. And so I had some exposure to some Tibetan teachers. And I think there was a sense of curiosity, because it seemed like these teachers who didn't have a lot of the things, very similar to what Yeshe was just mentioning, didn't have a lot of the trappings that society and schooling and all of these things were telling me were the way to go for happiness in life. And yet they seemed a lot happier than a lot of the people that I knew. So that was intriguing. And so I took refuge when I was a teenager, but I didn't really get involved real seriously until after I graduated from my undergrad studies in California in 2000. And then I went on pilgrimage over to India and Nepal and Tibet, and that really hooked me. Like being in those cultures and seeing it permeate life and getting exposed to that at least started to hook me. And then in particular going to this program for international students at Pulahari, where there was like in-depth daily study and practice of the Dharma and the philosophy behind it, and getting some sense of like the graduated path of Dharma kind of blew open my mind. So that really helped me. And then the rest, as Yeshe described, I think, so we did our 3-year retreat between 2013 and 2016, and have continued to work with the monastery over in Nepal. In fact, we were just, Yeshe was translating for some teachings there this morning. So it's been a busy Dharma day today, which is great.
And so your community is online, or do you also have in person?
Our community here in the US is what has been almost entirely in person until the pandemic, and then it's been online since then. We're starting to see we mostly work with individual centers, so we travel to different centers traditionally, and those would have been in person. But so it kind of depends on each of the centers, whether they're ready to open up or they're still doing things online. We've been doing things online when we initiate the teachings and the practices.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious what it's like, as I mentioned before, to be teaching in the context of being a couple. You mentioned when we had a conversation earlier on that you had done this 3-year retreat, and that you were kind of looking forward to being separate and being individuals, and that it ended up not being that. And so I'm curious what your experience of being a couple teaching is like.
It's a wonderful opportunity, I think. In some ways, having someone else to brainstorm with and to work together with, and planning the teachings and executing the teachings is lovely. It's great. One of the things that we often try to do too is just it seems like people get a lot out of seeing a Dharma couple or things like that, and so we have a lot of comments sometimes from people, and I guess simply it's just a pleasure. And of course, there's always difficulties. It's not like it's perfect or anything. But I think the fact that we both kind of had a parallel Dharma path and had so much of the teachings and trainings together and trained in similar ways, and yet we're very different individuals. So having both the differences and the similarities is quite helpful.
When you mentioned that people get a lot of seeing you as a couple, I started nodding because I feel that intuitively myself. But why do you think that is? What is it that people get?
Frankly, there are not a lot of women up here. And there are fewer women who are in long-term committed relationships as part of their Dharma path. And very often men and women will just come up with tears in their eyes, because it's such a big move for us in the West to have a different understanding of what authority is and who gets to speak. Yeah. And I think that just the visual transmits that in ways that no amount of talking can do. And it really moves people to see such a dramatic change, because this is a big change that we're seeing in the West. Teachers like you and other women, transgender, BIPOC teachers. This is a huge shift, and people feel it from all walks of life. And having that, sitting and watching that happen right before your eyes is something that really moves people in a very beautiful way. I'm often moved myself by the responses that people show.
And I think it's also helpful that it's helpful for people to see reflected different lifestyles as a way of living the Dharma.
Yeah.
So, you know, and really going deep into the Dharma. I know for me, one of the things that I've loved about, you know, our particular lineage of Tibetan Buddhism is that, you know, three of the Tibetan forefathers of the lineage, you know, one was a householder, translator, farmer, another was a yogi in the mountains, and his heart son was a monk, you know, so they all had very different paths, very different ways of being in the world, and yet they all experienced awakening and carried the Dharma teachings to many millions of beings now. So.
Another thing that I find really that resonates on an extra scale, so to speak, is that, you know, there's something about marriage, which itself is a container, it's a structure within which we can find a lot of freedom, and we can actually find supports for delving deep into areas that maybe we don't do if we're on our own. And that's very much the style of practice that we learned in Tibetan Buddhism. There's this sense of using structure as a platform for freedom, instead of something that's confining. So for example, this 3-year retreat, the cloister experience, it's completely cloistered. You don't have access to phones or internet or news. We get correspondence once a month. Nobody comes into the retreat unless they're a part of it. We don't leave. And it's cloistered in that way for 3 years and 6 weeks. And that in and of itself, it was just incredible how freeing something that when I first heard of it, I thought that was just insane. I mean, why would anybody do such a thing? But it turns out that it's so freeing. And there's something about the monastic quality of life that brings that structure and freedom, which is very much a part of how the Dharma spread in Asia, which is not really likely to happen so much as a main thread in the West. It's not a main way that it's manifesting. But I do think that there are ways that, be it in marriage or other contemplative lifestyles, lay people can have a sense of that structure and freedom in their own individual lives.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder also, having been married myself in the past, you know, the grounding quality of it, you know, where your partner is just not impressed at all. The student might be, right? Like, honey, I remember Pema Chödrön saying, you know, she was trying to do the Pema thing on her daughter, and her daughter being like, Mom, no, it doesn't work. So I think in a very nice way, it can be very grounding, right? Very humble.
It keeps you honest.
Exactly.
It definitely does. And you know, there's a lot of shortcuts. We all know what that's like in relationships that are really resonating well. There's a lot of things that I don't, you know, I can say in 2 or 3 words to Zopa that would take me half an hour to explain to anybody else, and vice versa. So that's also a really rich way of being able to know each other. And there's a quality of just somebody witnessing your life that you get in any kind of long-term relationship or marriage or family or friendship. That's really valuable. That's also that grounding quality of knowing that someone's a witness to the things that you go through in life is, I find something really powerful in that.
Yeah, and the potential, right? So people see you as a couple completely immersed in the Dharma and thinking, oh, okay, so perhaps I can do that. This is possible. And it's not possible, not just possible, but it's doable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a reason why we were born Westerners and ended up in the Dharma. And at the same time, that I feel like the way we practice and teach the Dharma is still very Asian centered. It's not as mainstream as a lot of Dharma centers in the West. At the same time, it's really important for other Westerners to have models of how to live the Dharma in lots of different ways.
Right.
So this is one possibility that we put out there for people, and I think of that as a practice in and of itself.
Yeah. So do you mind if we turn a little bit to Dharma directly?
Sure.
I, so as I was taking in, the instructions, for the practice, and then as I was doing it myself, I mean, a number of things came up. One of the things, as you were giving the instructions or the setup, Yeshe, as you were beginning, this concept of meditative inquiry, as you probably know, so at the heart of a particular kind of practice in Zen is koan study. Koan introspection is one way that we call it, and that is being able to hold a question, a situation, a query in your mind without turning it intellectually. And so when you're saying is, that what comes up, what you feel, and there's this element of tension, right? Because there's doubt, and there's the aspect of your mind that just wants to jump to the answer, just wants to see, just wants to wrap it up. And if you can hold that tension, then with the doubt and then the faith, right, the trust that you can see more clearly, that you can access a depth that is otherwise, it just kind of passes us by when we're just stuck, right, in the discursive mind. And so I'm curious how, if this is at all akin to how you understand this inquiry, or if there are aspects of it that are different.
I think there's a lot of resonance there, because it really isn't meant to be analytical. Part of what's interesting about it is that this is the third of a threefold practice. So it's listening, contemplating, and meditating. And the meditating is this meditative inquiry where we're doing this experiential analysis and resting, alternating between those two. But the idea is that we would have listened to teachings on whatever the particular topic is, or a koan, or whatever it might be, and then actually did spend time on that intellectual thinking off the cushion. And that might be discussions, it might be making outlines, it might be making images. I have a friend who loves to make Dharma teachings into songs. She rewrites the lyrics of popular songs into Dharma teachings. And there's lots of creative ways that the contemplative piece, the piece of the intellectual piece, works out. And the idea is that we use mind's inherent creativity to bring out, to draw out that intellectual understanding. But there's always that understanding that there's a gap, that we can't just stay with that intellectual understanding. And that I like to think of it as like a synapse between neurons. There's that space, and you're at this neuron, you have to get to that neuron. How are you going to bridge that synapse? And it's similar to that. There's that intellectual understanding, and we're trying to get to an experiential understanding, very much the way you talked about it. I love that sense of introspection, because it's very slow. It's not the discursive quality of thinking, and what about this and what about that. It's not as busy as that. And it is very heart-centered. It really is. One of the ways I explain it is like you're kind of looking around, you're groping around in the dark to find something you misplaced, instead of when I got here, I sat down, I put it down there, and then the other person came, and you're trying to like trace your steps abstractly in your head, as opposed to really getting in there and experiencing, getting your hands dirty, basically. So it's a lot more experiential, which I'm hearing you describe in that koan introspection, and that there's something about that tension, about staying with our discomfort. And also, when this meditative inquiry is developed even further, there's even a sense of dialogue. From the listening and the contemplating, you have a sense of what the Buddha has to say about, whatever given topic it might be, let's say death, because that's what Zopa was doing. And you're having this inner dialogue. Well, Buddha Shakyamuni, I'm not so sure about those hell realms. But in order to have that inner dialogue, you had to have processed some of the teachings to know what the content of those teachings are. And then you're sitting in that tension of not knowing what to make of it, and having that inner dialogue that allows you to get closer and closer to a hard experience that you couldn't necessarily put into words. And that's what's actually going to bridge that synapse, get across that gap from words and concepts to experience.
And so you're saying that you're sitting there and you're actually talking to the Buddha in your mind.
In a way, but it's much more, it's not like we're talking right now, which is
Right.
a lot of very bouncy back and forth kind of thing. It's more, I think of it as more like, you know, those old time like novels where somebody writes a letter and posts it and it gets to the other person. Days later, they write back and then you sit and listen. So there's those pauses, those meaningful pauses in between where you're really sitting with the experience and the question, just that quality of questioning in and of itself becomes part of the practice. So it isn't a dialogue the way we normally think of it. It's much slower and has a, you know, a very sort of steady stream that is more than just the one meditation session. It's going to go across sessions and weeks and months, maybe even years for some topics.
I have a million questions, but I actually wanted to give people a chance to, because it is such a different practice from what we're used to. Certainly contemplating our death a little bit, though we do work with the 5 remembrances, but certainly contemplating our rebirth, contemplating the hell realms, the lower realms in general. So I'm curious if people have reactions, comments, questions. How was that practice for you?
And we don't at all mind if people really heated it. Or, you know. We definitely we were also trained in like the monastic college system of debate a bit, where you have to like defend different viewpoints, even viewpoints that you don't necessarily believe. And, you know, it's quite, from the outside, it can feel quite combative, but it's really meant just to like not so harshly solidify it being on one side or another and identifying with it. So,
Yeah.
I see Colette has a hand.
Yeah, Jitsuko.
Thank you for the teachings that you gave us, and I really did not really connect very well with the first 2, but then the last one really, it led me nicely to a sense of gratitude for this life. The last one really led me to a sense of gratitude. So that felt great. But I did have some real issues with the one about you know, contemplating like the hell realms and contemplating my actions, and then just how does that help us not look at people that have bad karma in this life and think poorly of them, because it seems like this could really set a person up for thinking poorly about themselves, or looking at another situation and not having compassion, but saying, well, you know, they brought that on themselves with their negative actions, and that's why they're experiencing such and such, is because of their negative actions. And it can seem like really judgy. That's all.
Great, sure. I think that's such an important point, because especially around the teachings on karma, this kind of thing often comes up, right? How is it not victim blaming, right? Oh, they deserve it, right? Whereas, and this, I think in some ways, this is part of what we have to wrestle with, simply because of our, you know, our cultural inheritance, even if we didn't grow up Christian, or, you know, but growing up in this culture, I think there is some sense of like, oh, they're being punished, they deserve it, they did something to deserve it. Whereas from my understanding of the Buddhist teachings on karma, it's much more an explanation of a a natural law of cause and effect that helps us understand why things are the way they are, even though and all of that's embraced in the recognition that all beings simply want happiness and want to be free of suffering, right? So that's really the foundational groundwork that it's held in, that the teachings on karma are given in, is that recognition that, like, just as I want happiness and don't want ever to suffer, that's the same for all beings. And just as that's not what I'm experiencing, right? What if that's the case, then why do I keep encountering suffering time and time again, right? It's because our actions and our intentions are at cross purposes, right? We want happiness, but yet somehow our actions keep producing discontent, dukkha, suffering in various different forms, right? And so the more that we can identify that with ourselves and recognize that's true for all beings, then it's not so much a sense of like, oh, well, I'm better than them because I'm human or I had this good, but more a sense of, just like you were saying towards the end, that sense of like, oh, wow, this is a rare opportunity and it's impermanent, right? It's not like it's a me that lasts continually, that's guaranteed to be in this opportunity, right? Then we get more of a sense of the vulnerability that we're all in, of this vulnerable situation, and how wonderful it would be for us to not only help ourselves, but help all beings. But I think it's a beautiful question.
It is, and different Tibetan traditions, there's 4 major lineages, and different lineages will treat Buddha nature in different ways. But the Kagyu lineage really foregrounds that, and your question really hits that on the spot, because when we look at, to use your phrasing, which I think is spot on, when we look at other people and they're actively engaged in wrongdoing, Putin killing tons of people in Ukraine, or they're in the middle of a lot of suffering. When we look at it through the lens of Buddha nature, their nature is to be completely free of suffering, completely kind, loving, wise, gentle. And this is what they get. So if anything, it just heightens the compassion, and it sometimes is described as unbearable compassion, because it's so intense to see that someone whose nature is to be in perfect bliss is struggling in this way. So it's actually something that can be a spur to compassion. And this Zopa chose these particular prompts that are very traditional, because they point back to the first 2 parts of this practice, the listening and the contemplating. Some of that doesn't make a lot of sense without all of the details that would normally come ahead, but it demonstrates how the practice works, where the meditative inquiry will point you to other things to learn about. And even those practices, we can relate to what it feels like when we're under the domination of being angry and how horrible that feels. Or there's a lot of ways we can extrapolate in our own lives to what these negative rebirths might be. And those can actually be used to make our gratitude for this life even stronger, however strong our gratitude is. When we have something as dramatic as that to give us a contrast, then that stokes it even further. Does that answer your question? Wonderful question.
Yeah, that was very much the sense that I kept getting as I sat with this. And I just earlier today, I was writing about urgency and the vulnerability, of a human life. I've always, for some reason, felt that very keenly. And this practice, it just made me think again, there really is no time to waste. What am I doing when I'm wasting my time? I have no time to waste. So in that way, I find it very powerful.
And that's the real point of the meditation, right? I mean, it can call up sorrow or fear, and those things aren't necessarily the point, but they can help hone our focus to exactly what you're saying. So we say the sense of like, wow, there is no time to waste. And ironically, paradoxically, what usually ends up happening is we have more enjoyment, more appreciation of this life than when we try not to look at those things.
And you hit it on the head. It's the point of the practice is to give you that experience you had, instead of me saying, you know, you should really not waste your time. I could sit here for hours and you wouldn't have as powerful an experience as when you develop that from your heart. See a bunch of other hands.
Yes, Colette, did you want to go ahead?
Thank you. I found your contemplation on death absolutely spot on. I belong to a group of other Buddhists, and the name of our group is Aging and Buddhism. And this week we actually started teaching on Maranasati, which is the contemplation of death. And a lot of people are afraid because it sounds morbid, but it's extremely freeing, liberating, and crystallizing in making you aware that, yes, now is the moment to be alive, to embrace everything, and to live with the compassion and the love and the wisdom as much as you can, because you are one breath away from kaput, right? So it was really nice that you brought that in, and I really cherished it. And I think it's vital, even though it's unsettling for a lot of people, because death is, you don't want to talk about it. So I just want to thank you for that very much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Colette. And also, you know, part of what it makes me think about is how important it is, you know, because we're all going to die no matter what. If we think about death, if we don't think about death, if we avoid it, you know, so it's not like it's a remedy for dying, but it's a remedy for dying unprepared, right? And whether or not we believe in past and future lives, nevertheless, the more, even if we don't believe in future lives, if we don't think anything happens, still there's an immense amount of suffering at the time of death that I genuinely believe is alleviated simply by having cultivated our awareness that we are going to die. So I think it's very helpful.
And we see that among non-Buddhists all the time. People get a cancer diagnosis and some people plummet into despair, but there are folks who, when faced with death, actually start living their life even more fully. And that's exactly what I'm hearing you talk about, Colette, and that's the intent of this meditation, to really help us. One of the other things that I find it does is it holds a mirror up to the very petty things we engage in life, the little arguments and the resentments that we hold on to. All of a sudden, it's like, you know, why am I doing that? You know, when we're faced with something as inevitable and as huge as our own mortality, it puts everything into perspective.
And it also made quite stark the choices that we make, right? What am I choosing to spend my time and energy and resources on? Are those things really important? No matter how much money I make, no matter how many things I accumulate, I'm still going to die. Nothing, as you said, Zopa, none of that is going to save me from death. And so what is actually the most relevant thing for me to be putting my attention on? Right. It also brought that very keenly, to mind for me.
Yeah, that's definitely a major, again, another of the major points of the contemplation. Fear does come up. It can come up. But in the traditional teachings, it's called a wholesome fear because there's a point to it. It's not like if you just think, oh, I'm going to die and you're afraid. That by itself there's not much point to it because it doesn't keep death from happening. It doesn't make you necessarily happier now. But when we start cultivating the entire understanding, as you're saying, the choices that we make now, how am I living my life now, as opposed to how I would live if I knew I had a month to live? What would be different? What choices would shift? Where can I loosen the grip on my attachment to things and my aversion to things, the apathy I have to most everything else. And how can I be more engaged in my own life?
Marguerite?
I do want to say ditto to all of those things. And I want to say too that I wish I wasn't 76 years old. I wish I was 56 years old. However, I'm going to make the most of today, tonight, and tomorrow. And I thought, now where can I go and volunteer? And then I thought, and where can I spend my money? I can't wait to spend my money. Where am I going to spend it? I think I will go to my daughter asked me to go to her bachelorette party in Texas, and I'm in Buffalo. And I thought, oh, I'm not going to do that. Well, I'm going to go to Texas, and I'm going to be at her bachelorette party. And I just thought, what else can I do? I mean, how can I go at it? So I got motivated, but I still got afraid. And then I thought of all those animals and thought, what the hell did they do in a previous life? How did they get to be rats and bugs and lions? And then I thought, I'm certainly going to not step on an ant. I'm going to be more sacred to sentient beings. So I really got to focus on that. And basically gratitude, a whole lot of it. I've often had it, but I have more of it now. Then I saw you guys as spiritual partners, and Zuisei will know I was going to go to the monastery just to look for a partner, just hunting out somebody. Is there anybody here that might want to be my spiritual partner in life? And then I end up with a spiritual partner that I divorce. So go figure. And so I guess I'm where I'm supposed to be. Life is giving me just what I need to learn, and how fortunate I am. So those three teachings just made sense, that I'm where I'm supposed to be. Life is giving me what I need, and I'm very fortunate. So thank you for bringing those to life in my life.
Thank you. That's wonderful.
And it sounds like you're seizing the opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yes. Yep. I am. Come to Buffalo. We can have a good time.
It looks cold there.
I know, but there's lots of places to dance.
Oh, that's good.
Alexandra?
How do I follow that? So for most of my life, I was close to death, and I would have been grateful for it. But now my life has changed such that I relish life, and it has brought so much color to my life. That's the only way that I can kind of describe it. And I hadn't really realized it till we did the first part of that, is just how full it is for me and how grateful I am. And if I were to pass away, in a couple of days, I could without, regret. The second part, all right, so I don't believe that we're going to be reborn. I just have to say it. It's something that, however, I've been proven wrong many, many times. So just in case. I entertained that idea, and I thought, you know what? I reflected on my life. My life was the hellish, realm. And then much of my life was that starving ghost, right? And then most of my life has been one of just dead fear all the time. So I realized, I'm like well suited if I'm, reborn into those, and there's a high probability. But then I thought, what do I do? Do I go into despair? And I thought, no, you know what? All I could do is just enjoy every minute of my life for the rest of this time. I have no control over what happens when I die. None. I feel all I have control over is every minute from this moment forward. And I don't understand karma, but I do understand, the need to, be a better person. And so I just thank you. That was really, really good. I don't understand why people don't talk about death. It's just as common as birth.
Exactly. You
Thank
can't you can't have one without the other, right? I mean, they're connected, right? And it is very funny that we value life and fear death, even though they're a continuum. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really lovely what you just said, that sharing about the various experiences that you can see in your own life that are metaphors for the various realms. Because honestly, without some kind of background in karma and positive rebirths, negative rebirths, all these realms, it's really elaborate. The Buddhist cosmology is pretty elaborate. And there's no requirement anywhere that we just hear it and say, okay, I'm going to sign up for that. Very much the opposite. We're meant to actually engage with it. And I wanted to pick up on something you said, which is until we are either interested in learning more about karma or other realms, a wonderful way to work with it is, I always call it the what if meditation. So we take it as a working hypothesis that I heard you say, just, I mean, it's not going to kill anybody for the space of a meditation to say, okay, let's pretend this is how it is. How would that change my life? How would that have an impact on the choices I make, on how I use my time, what I decide to do or not do? And, you know, just very generally speaking, if being a good person, which pretty much equates to virtuous karma, is going to help to set up a positive rebirth in this working hypothesis, then there you go. Because actually, when we think about it, we have precious little control over even this life. There are some things, very small things, that we have some control over. But that underlying vulnerability of all beings is that at any moment, that what little control we have is pulled away or without any notice. So I feel like you really hit a lot of the main points without having to sign up for, you know, the full-on description of all the realms and the creatures and all these things. There's lots of different ways to engage with this that still allow us to connect with the Buddha and his teachings as he presented it. So there's a lot of talk about, well, the Buddha really didn't mean karma and rebirth. He didn't mean this or that. Nobody really knows what the Buddha meant. But we know from very strong evidence over many, many countries in Asia that this is the way he chose to present it. He must have thought there was something of value. And whatever way we have that feels meaningful for us to connect with it, the way you described it is lovely. Just to say, okay, I'm gonna just wing it for the space of this meditation. That brings us a little closer to the Buddha's intention, to his idea for how to get the Dharma across to us. So whatever way we connect is a valuable one.
And I think of that story in the sutras, and I don't have the source, unfortunately, but where the Buddha essentially says to someone, if you believe in rebirth, then good, you know, be good in this life so that you have a good rebirth. And if you don't believe in rebirth, well, be good in this life so that you can enjoy this life. Either way, you don't really lose. Just be good, period.
Yeah.
Nina?
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm joining on the phone and I really regret missing the practices. But it's never too late for the present moment, the end of your talk. And I wanted to go back to the question that Zuisei asked about the dialogical quality you were referring to. And since I wasn't present virtually for the practices, I was interested in, I think it was it's not a metaphor, but you said that it was like searching, heart-centered was like groping for something in the dark, but not in an intellectual way of where was I when I dropped the car keys. And I wondered, somehow when Zuisei asked, like you're in dialogue with the Buddha, something sort of flashed into my mind, or just an association that I don't know if others, will have some recognition, but very often when I'm reading the sutras or the Dharma, or even just opening up some kind of book, even by Thich Nhat Hanh or somebody, there's an asking of questioning, almost like you would oracle, asking a question, knowing that there's no answer except what arises from that conversation with the Dharma and with the question itself. And I think you said something like sitting with it. I don't remember. I guess I'm just really curious whether that what resonated with me is what is close to what you were describing.
Yeah, so the full example that I use for that experiential analysis is, let's say you're in a hotel room. So if you've never been in this room before, it's your first night there. And in the middle of the night, the power goes out, the night lights are out, the clocks are out, it's pitch dark. So of course you've got glasses and you need to put on your glasses to try to make some sense of it. So you can lie there in bed completely still and say, oh gosh, where are my glasses? Just like you said, I know that I was in the bathroom and I had them on there, and you're completely still. You're just almost not embodied. You're just thinking entirely in your head. It's a total abstraction. You're imagining things, as opposed to, I have to find my glasses and now the fire alarm is going off and I better go find them. And you're groping around. So in that groping, there's a kind of physicality because you're using your senses, your touch and so forth. But there's also, oh no, this is paper. Oh no, this is a book. Oh no, glasses. So there's still an analytical quality that's happening with the subtle physicality. And that's the quality of the inquiry that's happening. It's not up here at all. It's really coming from the heart, really sort of leading with experience instead of leading with thought. And then when I talk about dialoguing with the Buddha, that's a common example in the way they present this teaching. But when you think about it from the perspective of Buddha nature, what is the Buddha? The Buddha is our own true nature of mind. What this practice is getting to is sitting still with the true nature of our own mind, with questions, open questions that spark our curiosity, our interest. And that's what invokes that precise knowing, the prajna, which we don't necessarily activate very, very much in the context of Dharma. So the aim of the practice is to start bringing up that prajna in the context of Dharma. And the consummate example of this practice is meditation on emptiness, shunyata, because we're trying to have an experiential understanding of non-self. And that happens through sitting with the qualities right in our mind and having our own curiosity, our own groping in the dark be what invokes that prajna. Now, as I mentioned before, it's connected to actually listening to teachings on non-self, for example, or death, as we did earlier, and really having thought about it for some time, having a clarity about what the teachings are saying, what that understanding is. And then we're actually sitting with that. So what we're actively dialoguing with is our own understanding that we developed while we were listening and contemplating. But what's happening under the surface is that we're tapping that bottomless well of infinite qualities of mind and invoking them. And as we invoke it and then we rest, we basically marinate in that experience, we're instilling it. We're getting the Tibetan word gom, which usually is translated as meditation, literally means to cultivate familiarity. We're getting familiar with the qualities of our own true nature of mind. And the more we do that, the more we habituate ourselves to that, the more accessible they are, the more there are immediate resource spontaneously without all of these steps. So it becomes more and more the view that we take off the cushion and into life and so forth. So basically it's a practice for connecting with those qualities, instilling them, and really incorporating them into our everyday life. Not only so we'll feel better, because that's great, not only so that others will benefit from this, because that's also great, but so we can uproot the misperception that is samsara and transcend to the point where we're accessible for all beings in the way that the mind of enlightenment is accessible for all. So the Tibetan Buddhist practice is very, very much foregrounds, not only the possibility, not only the capacity, but the inevitability of each and every being attaining enlightenment. And this is one of the ways that that happens.
That's kind of the perfect closing, the inevitability of enlightenment. That's wonderful. We have run out of time. I just want to make sure if anybody else has any last minute thoughts or questions. Yes, Liz.
I'm thinking about the Buddha's awakening and his seeing all his past lives at that time. How do you interpret that? I mean, I don't think I'll ever get to that place where I see all my past lives or my future lives, but how do you see that? I'm just curious.
How do I understand that particular moment, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, I have something. Do you want to say something first?
I mean, I'll let you go ahead.
I see that as the Buddha sitting under the Bodhi tree and seeing his past and future lives and seeing the past and future lives of other beings, which is how he himself describes it in the suttas. So what I understand that to mean is Buddhahood in our tradition is equated with omniscience, but not omniscience like we immediately hear omniscience and we're like, oh, give me the lottery numbers for next week because if you know everything, I want to know those. But omniscience is very particular. It means understanding phenomena just as they are and in their full extent, understanding everything it takes to awaken, because the name Buddha means awaken. So how I understand that is that the Buddha awakens to the full range of experience and all of the, in our tradition, we call them obscurations that cloud the ability of mind to know the full range of experience are completely lifted. They all fall away. But in that same sutta, when he's describing his enlightenment, probably the thing that moves me the most is his description after the enlightenment experience is over. He's wandering around in the trees around the Bodhi tree in the forest. And he's reflecting on that experience. And what he says is, this peace so profound, this unpolluted, uncreated, clear light, this nectar-like Dharma that I have found, to whomever I may teach it, it will remain an enigma. So I will remain silent and stay here alone in the forest. We always talk about the four truths as the Buddha's first teaching, and it's certainly his first public teaching. But to me, that's his first teaching. It's so subtle. It's so beyond concepts and words that even the Buddha doesn't know how in the world he's going to get this across. So then he comes up with skillful methods. And I take everything that the various traditions in Asia of Buddhism tell us about the Buddha, his life and his teachings as the skillful methods for us to encounter that unpolluted, uncreated, clear light, the true nature of our mind.
Now I'm wishing we had 2 more hours. Thank you so much, Yeshe and Zopa.
Thank
It is
you
such,
so much.
such a pleasure.